Now, as I mentioned at the start, we're in for a rough economic ride over the coming years. A short time ago, I caught up with Shadow Home Affairs Minister Karen Andrews and started by asking her whether the Albanese government needs to cut spending in next month's budget.
Look, I think they do need to be looking at cutting spending. What surprised me a little bit in question time today was that there was really a lack of detail that was coming from Labor, and it left me wondering whether or not they actually understand the magnitude of the issues for everyday people who are copping or about to get an increase in their fuel costs. Their cost of living has gone up dramatically, particularly with either their mortgage payments, their rents for those people that actually get a rental at the moment, and I'm not sure that there's much recognition of the hardship that people are going through by Labor at the moment, which is very concerning in the last couple of weeks before the budget is brought down.
Well, indeed, they seem preoccupied at the moment with blaming the previous government, the government you were a part of. Now, of course, the power price rises didn't come out of nowhere. The government debt hasn't come out of nowhere. But I think taxpayers, voters really need to know now what Labor's going to do about it.
I couldn't agree more. So Labor is certainly doing all that it can to make sure that it continues to put the blame for everything back on the previous government, so the coalition government, and I think it's appalling. I mean, they've now been in government for a few months, and I really would have thought that they would have had spent all those years that they had in opposition working out what their plans were going to be, but they clearly haven't. And I say that with a degree of confidence about what we had done when we were in opposition the last time, and that's where the development effectively of the Operation Sovereign Borders came from, because that work was done in opposition so that when we were elected and we're in government, we were able to deal with those issues. Now, Labor is doing a lot of talking at the moment, holding summits, setting up committees, reviews, all those sorts of things, but they're not doing anything proactively to deliver, which is very disappointing.
Well, the coalition is not exactly putting up policy alternatives at the moment either. The key question, I suppose, for Australians is whether or not we're going to go into recession. Do you think Australia is headed for a recession?
I think we've got to recognise that it is a possibility that that's where Australia would end. I hope that is not the case. I think the budget is going to be very critical. But the important part out of the budget too is to make sure that there is some cost of living relief for people who are doing it incredibly tough at the moment. And there is no light at the end of the tunnel that we can see. And Labor is not showing how they're going to work their way through the problems that they are currently facing.
All right, let's look at an area that you have responsibility for. It's the cyber security area. That massive breach, that massive hack and data breach from Optus last week. The government was asked about that today. The relevant minister had this to say.
Optus have advised that this breach has revealed some personal data of 9.8 million Australians. Of those 2.8 million Australians, significant amounts of personal data has been taken. Responsibility for this security breach rests with Optus, and I want to note that the breach is of a nature that we should not expect to see in a large telecommunications provider in this country.
Claire O'Neill, the minister there. Is she right to say that you can't blame the government for this and in fact Optus should have ensured that it never happened?
Well, I thought it was a pretty surprising response from Claire O'Neill in question time today. Labor is very good at pointing the finger, and of course Claire O'Neill was immediately able to point the finger at Optus and say that it's all their problem and their issue. I don't necessarily agree with that from the perspective of how the government has dealt with the announcement by Optus that there had been the significant data breach. Government does have a role to provide a level of confidence and support to consumers. I don't believe that they've done that. I think that the minister responsible has done next to nothing to explain to people what had happened. And in fact, in question time, and I listened carefully to her answer, and I don't believe that she said much at all that wasn't already in the public domain. So that was disappointing.
If I could interrupt, do we know what happened? Do we know whether this was an act of government, a government trying to interfere in Australia, or do we think this was a criminal act by someone trying to extort money from Optus?
The advice that I have been given is that it is most likely to be an act that was undertaken with criminal intent. So to steal the data and then to monetise that data. So it will ultimately be sold on the dark web if it's not already there now. So that's the early advice that I have been given. Now, I spoke to Optus yesterday, and I appreciated that opportunity. They also raised the issue of credit facilities. So I thought it was a bit weak of the minister in question time to start demanding of Optus to do something that she surely must have known that they were already considering. And of course, Optus announced it I think it was about half an hour, 40 minutes after that really quite unusual demand by Claire O'Neill that they were going to do it.
Okay, the minister did, though, suggest that they'll look at changing the laws, changing policies around this area. She hinted that there could be a new regime where companies are fined millions of dollars, perhaps hundreds of millions of dollars, if they don't keep data secure, if they expose their customers to breaches like that. Will you look at working with the government to update the laws in that way?
Yes, because I want a good outcome for Australia. And I understand that the minister responsible is clearly floundering around trying to find a solution at the moment. That's why we've stepped up. We put in the ransomware private members bill this morning so that we could be on the front foot. This is legislation that we put in place in February into the House. I have demonstrated over and over a willingness to work in the best outcomes of Australians. I'm happy to help the Home Affairs Minister to get her job done.
Well, we'll see. Thanks for joining us, Karen. I appreciate your time.
A pleasure. Thank you.
Big issue this, isn't it? I mean, if you're a customer of a big communications giant like Optus, do you expect them to keep your data safe? Yes. To borrow their slogan, yes, you do. But of course, governments have got to be involved too. There's too much here on hand for private enterprise to handle on its own. They need the resources of the cyberspace experts and equipment in defence and the like. Big issue that's going to be with us for many, many years to come. So we'll follow that one as they look at changing the laws around this.